It was donated by Procter & Gamble when we opened the Freedom Center here. But I'm sure some of you and a lot of you have heard the story of Margaret Garner. Not somewhere around where you guys are over in Kentucky. Margaret Garner was a house slave on a plantation in Richmond, Kentucky. Richwood, Kentucky, over by Walton. She was a house slave. She was married to a slave, Robert Garner, who was a field slave on a neighboring plantation. She was 22 years old. She was pregnant with her 5th child. The only child that belonged to Robert, her husband, was the first child. The rest of them were all the children of Archibald Gaines, who was her owner. She was a product of rape between a owner and a black woman. Margaret was. Her children were the product of rape between a white man and a white man against a black woman. So at the time, Margaret was very light-skinned. Her children were very light-skinned as each generation got a little bit lighter because of all the rampant rape that was going on at the time. So anyway, they decided they were going to escape. They picked the coldest day in the history of Cincinnati up to that time to make their escape. Robert went over, got a sleigh, went over to Margaret, picked up Margaret and the children and his parents, took them over right across the river here in Covington. They got off the sleigh, they left the sleigh there, they walked across the frozen river. Margaret had a cousin who lived in Cincinnati. So they went to the cousin's house, and the cousin went off to find Levi Coffin, who was an Underground Railroad conductor in Cincinnati, so they could get started on their way. In the meantime, Archibald, now it was unheard of, pretty much, that slave owners would go after their own slaves. They hired people to do it. They couldn't leave their fields. Archibald Gaines actually went to Covington to get Margaret back. And just a little aside about that, a lot of people, we're under the conception that a lot of the slaves escaped on Saturdays because they generally had Sundays off if you were a field slave. House slaves were on call 24/7, so they didn't really have the opportunity because they would be missed right away. But actually, slave catchers did not work on Saturday either. They did not work on Saturday or Sunday. So the slave would be missed on Saturday, but if nobody was there to go after them, they got a 2-day head start. So, but anyway, Archibald Gaines was already there. He burst into the house, that Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, we're going to talk about that a little bit over there. He was able to burst into the house, deputize people, and to get his property back. As he burst in, Margaret took the opportunity, and this is really hard to hear, and I'm sure it's going to sound familiar to some of you because you know the story, took the opportunity to grab a knife, and she slit the throat of her 2-year-old daughter. She said, she tried to kill all of her children. She said, I would rather all of my children were dead than to go back into slavery. Now, those of us who are parents, I can't even hardly say that without crying. But that's what happened. So she didn't have the opportunity to do that. She was put under arrest. Kentucky wanted her charged under the Fugitive Slave Act for destruction of property. That baby was the property of Archibald Gaines because Margaret was the property of Archibald Gaines. Ohio wanted her tried for murder because they knew she'd get off. Kentucky won. She was sold down the river. That old expression, sold down the river. To Arkansas, ended up dying a couple years later of malaria. Her husband, Robert, fought in the Civil War, came back after the Civil War, and was interviewed by the Cincinnati Enquirer. He has no idea what happened to the child that she was pregnant with. The 9-month-old daughter died on the way down to Arkansas. He kept the 2 boys together and fought in the Civil War, came back and was interviewed. We have court records, myriads of court records in Cincinnati about this trial. And she was not the only person who did this, but because it happened in a free state, it became, a big news story.